vaccines for kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. No nukes.
Good morning, Toledo, and good afternoon, Columbus, and hello to those of you listening on the internet, wherever and whenever you are. My name is Joe DeMare, and you have been one of the lucky ones who's tuned into For a Green Future. For a Green Future is a show where we talk about ecology and the environment, and we talk about them in the ways that they affect you, your wealth, your health, your happiness, the wealth and health and happiness of your friends and families and pets and the critters, the birds and the bees and everything living around you, because like it or not, we're all mixed up in on this wonderful ecosystem called planet Earth. I had to run back out to my car because I forgot my cell phone, which is actually an important thing because Rebecca's on the line. We only have one open line now on 100.7. So if you want to contact me while Rebecca's on the line, my co-host, and she'll be calling in after 10:30, then you would text. You text me at 419-973-5841. 419-973-5841, and I'll read your text on the air, assuming it's not too rude or anything. Well, even if it is rude, as long as it's not obscene, I'll read your text on the air. But we've got a good show for you today. I'll be talking with you for about 15 minutes or so about some things that have happened to me in the last couple of days, this past week, that might be of interest. And then we have an interview with Dr. George Bullerjahn, and he's from Bowling Green State University. And he is a microbiologist, and I called him because we're coming up on blue-green algae season, and I kind of wanted to talk about what that whole thing's going to look like this year. Are we going to have problems with it or not? So we had a very nice interview. You'll be hearing about 10:15. Then we hear from our wonderful patrons and sponsors, and Becca will be joining us, hopefully, at 10:30. And I've asked her to do a report on copepods. Yeah, you'll hear a little bit about copepods in our interview with Dr. Bullerjahn. They're an important but overlooked part of the ecosystem. I mean, literally without them, the Earth's ecosystems would collapse. There'd be nothing living in the oceans or the lakes or the streams. And so they're an important part, but it's not something you hear about every day. So it's the kind of thing we like to talk about on For a Green Future. Excuse me. And then we'll be hearing some news, ecological news from around the country. Although we're going to start out with a very local environmental news story that I'd like to talk to you about that has to do with the old Interurban Railroad. So, but that'll be after we hear from Becca. And hopefully at any point during the show, we'd like to hear from you. And you can call us at any time at 877-909-1007. That's 877-909-1007. And we like to talk to you about any kind of ecological or environmental question that you might have, or if you hear about something on the show. And today's show, particularly, since we're going to be talking about the Interurban Railroad, I'm going to be talking about that bridge over the Maumee, the one that over down by Waterville that links Lucas and Wood County. And do you have any personal memories of that bridge? Did you do anything on that bridge when you were a kid, or as you were growing up? Because as you're going to hear in the story, there's some very interesting news about it. So now's a good time to talk about it. I wanted to start out talking about a pleasant experience I had yesterday. I went over to the WW Nature Preserve because I had gotten a request as a press member to attend something that was going on there by the Wood County Park District. And just full disclosure, they are one of the sponsors of this show. But we were invited, the press was invited to go watch a project that was being done by Ian Russell. And he's a junior, and he was doing his Eagle Scout project. And his Eagle Scout project was to create solitary bee habitats. And you might have actually seen this at both Channel 11 and Channel 13 were there, covered it. But he did a big project. He installed 5 of these solitary bee habitats in Perrysburg at different places, like at the 577 Foundation. And at the last one, the 5th one, went in at WW Night. And solitary bees are not your European honeybees that everybody's used to thinking about. They literally are solitary bees. They don't have a hive. They don't make honey, but they're still extremely important in terms of pollinating things. They are a native bee, so they're not the European honeybees that we're all familiar with. They were here before the European honeybees came over. And like many insects, they have trouble with finding suitable habitat, because if this were all deep, dark forest, the way it was supposed to be, the way it was before we cut them all down, there'd be plenty of little places, little holes in trees and things where they could build their nests and raise their young. But they don't have that now. And so Ian Russell, after doing a lot of research, went and built this thing, which you can go see if you go to WW Night. It's just off the trail. And it was a project that was sponsored by the Perrysburg Country Garden Club, and they donated $1,000. And Ian raised another 600 or so from other sources. And I was talking with Ursula Klug, who was part of the backing for this project. And it was a very nice project. The very well-built little habitat that you could see, and it was designed so that other critters can't get in there and eat the bees. And those bees, the way they raise their young is they find holes or cavities in wood or in buildings, and they wall off, they lay their eggs in the cavity, then they wall it off with mud. So it's like a little mud end cap. And after visiting them and watching this bee shelter go up, I actually went home and discovered that I had one of these. It was in the end of the clothesline pole in my backyard. That the big, some solitary bees have walled that off with some mud. And I know that in there are the little larvae, and the bees will come back and forth and give them pollen and feed them until they're ready to leave and go off on their own. So it's very nice. It's very gratifying to see a young man who has taken to heart the idea of protecting nature, of preserving nature, and giving habitat to a species of insect that's very important to the ecosystem, but which has trouble finding places to live. And another one of the garden club members actually told me that she had bought one of those commercial bee shelters and put it up in her yard. And then in the spring, in February, she watched as a downy woodpecker came and ate all the bees that were in there, which, is part of the whole ecosystem thing. I mean, she probably saved that downy woodpecker. They might have made it through the winter because it was able to eat the bees she was raising. But sometimes one of the principles in ecological science is that if populations have a protected source, if they have a place where they can raise their young, where they can reproduce without any predation, then that species will probably do very well and will stick around and survive in the whole ecosystem. Because if you don't have a sheltered place, if you don't have a spot you can move out from, send colonies out from, then your whole population is always in a state of flux, always threatened with extinction. And that's true of any kind of animal, and including bees. And so it was a very nice little way to spend Saturday morning going out there. And I also had a very nice experience interviewing Dr. George Bullerjahn. So I'm going to set this up now. We're heading over to our interview with George, as he just likes to be addressed as. That's how he answers the phone. Hello, it's George. There's a number of things that go into, a number of factors that go into this blue-green algae bloom that sometimes happens on Lake Erie, and more frequently happens on Lake Erie. And it's good. I mean, we hear about it when it's happening, but it's good to think about it all the time, because, now is the time that we can maybe prevent this algal bloom from happening later in the summer. And really, it's kind of up to the farmers to change their ways to make it possible for us to not have this terrible bloom every year on Lake Erie. But you'll hear more about that in our interview. So, Josh, I think we're all set. Okay, let's go ahead and run that interview. This is Dr. George Bullerjahn from Bowling Green State University. Let's start with your name and your title.
My name is George Bullerjahn. I'm Professor Emeritus at Bowling Green State University and Director of the NIH NSF Great Lakes Center for Fresh Waters and Human Health.
Well, that's great. That's a kind of a mouthful, but we're grateful that you're on the show today. Welcome to For Agreed Future.
Yes, well, thanks. It's great to be here. These are interesting times with our algal blooms. So
yes, we're coming up on the season, and we'll get to the algal blooms in just a second. But I was kind of wondering if you could give us some background on what a healthy lake ecosystem looks like in terms of the microorganisms. I mean, what sort of critters would you expect to find there? What kind of ratios would you see between, let's say, algae and things that eat algae? What does a healthy lake look like?
Healthy look. I'm trained as a microbiologist, so I really think about the lower food web. So when it comes to higher organisms, top of the food chain, you'll have to talk to a fisheries biologist. But for me, a healthy lake has a mixture of phytoplankton, which basically supply or drive the food web, dominated by diatoms and green algae. There will always be cyanobacteria present. And when you hear the word cyanobacteria, you might think that that's a dirty word, and it's not. There are many cyanobacteria are good guys, and the ones that we see that in these poor conditions are the bad actors. And so there can be cyanobacteria there. Zooplankton, copepods, feeding on the algae, other zooplankton that then go up the trophic levels to feed fish and beyond. So what we want is a mixture of different kinds of algae. We have some very good instrumentation that can measure the different kinds of algae that are present. And but diatoms are pretty much universally good guys, green algae. We don't want chlorophyll levels to be that high. When you have eutrophic conditions, lots of nutrients, you have chlorophyll levels, above 30 micrograms per liter. You're dealing with.
Okay, I gotta ask you to pause for just a second there. You said when you get eutrophic levels. I mean, so that's when we've crossed over into an unhealthy lake, right? Eutrophic means.
Right. That's when the lake has become very productive, and there's lots of algae, and that can cause additional problems because as algal biomass dies, that falls to the bottom, and then bacteria will degrade that, and that can consume oxygen. And so you don't want hypoxic conditions consequently.
I see. Okay, so a nice, healthy lake ecosystem has these green algae, and you mentioned diatoms. Those are those little dinosaur-looking things. They're kind of.
They're algae that have a cell wall made out of silica. Basically, they live inside a little tiny greenhouse, a little glass shell, and they typically bloom in the spring and in the winter. But they're there typically all year round. But they're indicative of a healthy lake in most instances.
Okay, cool. Now I've read one of your articles that you've published, kind of a summary, and talking about the cyanobacteria. Those are the ones that are cause the quote-unquote blue-green algae bloom. And it looks like from your research that this cyanobacteria can actually sort of eat herbicides like Roundup. Is that correct?
Well, some can utilize glyphosate as a phosphorus source, which was something that came as a surprise when they first saw that. But we calculated a few years back that there's a lot of use of glyphosate, of course, in the region. There's a lot of runoff, and you can detect byproducts of glyphosate all the way down the Maumee River into the lake. However, if you add up how much phosphorus is contributed by that amount of glyphosate applied to fields, it's really only about 1% of the total phosphorus. So we don't think it's actually changing the nutrient loads appreciably. I think the use of glyphosate has other issues in that glyphosate can kill off other algae and allow cyanobacteria to thrive. That you would likely not see that as too much of an issue in Lake Erie, but where glyphosate is applied as a herbicide around small lakes and reservoirs, it could play a role there, promoting the growth of cyanobacteria over other kinds of algae.
Okay, so the glyphosate might not be one of the main factors in the green algae blooms, although it sounds like it plays something of a role. But so what? Yeah,
I'd say it could play a role in smaller reservoirs and small lakes near where glyphosate has been applied. But in terms of looking at the global nutrient budget of Lake Erie, I don't view that as much of a concern.
Okay, so what are the biggest concerns then? What are the main things that we're worried about with these algal blooms?
Well, it's really there are a few issues here that largely pertain to nutrients. The dominant source is of nitrogen and phosphorus, and a lot of the work is focused on phosphorus, but we can't ignore nitrogen as the other major nutrient which drives these events. The nutrients have an agricultural source largely. The amount of rainfall driving agricultural nutrients into streams, into the Maumee River and other rivers, into Lake Erie, are the big problem. Most of the nutrient load is an agricultural source. Now, what has been recommended is to mitigate these blooms is to reduce the phosphorus load by 40%. And that's based on looking at the variability in the bloom intensity from one year to the next. In those years where the load is about 40% lower, the bloom is really non-existent or is negligible. Now, that may or may not be correct, because one thing we're seeing over years now is that the total amount of phosphorus, the total phosphorus really isn't changing that much. What is changing is the amount of soluble reactive phosphorus, in other words, free phosphate. So phosphorus comes in different forms. There's phosphorus that's bound to organic material, and then there's phosphorus which is free phosphate in the water. Now, phosphate is going up. Total phosphorus is staying staying reasonably stable. So the 40% reduction might be a good target, but what we really need to be doing is tracking the dissolved phosphate as our signal. And so the main source is agricultural nutrients. Trying to understand exactly, phosphate versus total phosphorus is something we need to be looking at more closely.
Okay, so how does this season's algal bloom? How's it looking? Can you make any predictions yet?
There's an early one. I don't run that model, but there's an early release of the model that indicates that the bloom will not be as intense this year because it was dry during the early part of during the early spring. Now, we have had some recent downpours, and so maybe the model will change between now and when the official model is released on June 30th. So, stay tuned, but the initial indicator is this will be a milder bloom year, which is good news for everybody, of course.
All right, fingers crossed. Now, when we set this interview up, you mentioned that you're going out in the field tomorrow. What'll you be doing when you're out in the field?
We have a number of instruments which monitor lots of parameters in the water, and they require lots of maintenance. And they're very valuable. They report data to the internet every 20 minutes on nutrient concentrations, water temperature, water clarity, how much chlorophyll is in the water, how much other pigments that may indicate cyanobacteria, how much of that is in the water, and other chemical parameters, which can really help us understand whether a bloom is forming or not, and what the potential drivers of blooms are at that time. And so there are there's a great deal of interest and a great deal of effort building a smart lake. We have this, the Great Lakes Observing System is a network of sensors which are deployed throughout the Great Lakes, and Lake Erie specifically has got a lot of these. And different institutions monitor or are in charge of different nodes of instruments that all report together. And so tomorrow I'm going out there. We have some issues with one of our sensors in Sandusky Bay, and we'll be fiddling with that for a while.
Oh, sounds interesting. So these are attached to buoys and they're spread throughout the lakes, or are they mostly near the shore, or where would you find these?
Most are near the shore. We have our two data nodes in Sandusky Bay. One is on a buoy in the outer bay. The other one is attached to the Route 2 Edison Bridge, and but most of the buoys are near shore events, measured near shore events, because that's where the blooms really are happening on kind of the Ohio side of Lake Erie. But throughout the Great Lakes, there are buoys in very remote, deep lakes. There are buoys in the middle of Lake Superior in 1,000 feet of water. So it's a remarkable data set across the entire region.
Ah, cool. So, what do you find so fascinating about the microenvironments of freshwater lakes here? What kind of triggered you into going into this area?
I think microbes are the most interesting organisms on Earth because they drive all the geochemical events that all life depends on. So every nitrogen atom in your body and my body is there because a microbe processed that atom of nitrogen so it's there. Okay, if all the microbes on the Earth were to stop doing what they're doing, all life on Earth would end. And so I have to ask myself, what are the most important organisms? I say, those are the microbes. I mean, there are some folks that feel differently, but I just look at what's the most dominant biomass on Earth, and what is the biomass that drives all other life on Earth, and it's the microorganisms. And so that's kind of my approach, and that's basically the first. When I teach my microbiology class, that's basically the first thing I tell my students.
So if people want to see what you're doing, keep up maybe with some of the research, what would you suggest for a person who's interested in the health of Lake Erie? What kind of websites should they visit? Who should they follow, etc.?
We have our center has a website at Bowling Green State University for the that's www.btsu.edu/Great Lakes Center. The Great Lakes Observing System. It's the habs.gloss.us. The Great Lakes just search Great Lakes Observing System or GLOS. That provides data around the Great Lakes, but isn't just data that scientists would use as weather data. If you want to go boating, if you want to know something about where you're going to be, water temperature, so forth, that will provide you information that may help you with recreation and enjoying the lakes. Looking up there's a national laboratory, NOAA GLERL, or the NOAA Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab in Ann Arbor has a very nice website looking at harmful algal bloom, looking at about the health of the Great Lakes, all sorts of resources about the Great Lakes in general. So I would look at that. And then if you're actually worried about harmful algal blooms and the toxins that they produce and whether they're present or not, the Ohio EPA does a very, very good monitoring system and whose data are all online. So I would recommend that as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Bullerjahn. And we're back live here at the studio. Hope you found that interesting. I know I did. And it's just an illustration that these things that happen, like the algal blooms, if you're a scientist, if you know the science behind it, if you study ecology, they're not mysteries. They're not, oh man, why is there a bloom this year and not that year? We have reached the point where we can say, okay, there's a bloom this year because we put this much phosphorus and this much nitrogen into the lake, and that caused these organisms to die out and those organisms to bloom. And so now we're just at the point where we have to get those things into our policies, into our actual laws, and have them actually make a difference in the way we do things. And so that's a very important point. And but there's people who know what's going on, folks, and all we have to do is listen to them, and we'll have a cleaner, healthier future. And speaking of clean and healthy things, the parks, the Wood County Park District is one of our sponsors. The Wood County Park District is a natural resources conservation agency. They protect natural spaces, maintain quality green spaces, provide engaging programming, and they teach people to love and respect nature. They restore wildlife habitats, and they lead outdoor adventures. Wood County Parks protects natural spaces in Wood County for all to enjoy from 8 a.m. to 30 minutes past sunset every day of the year. And there's several ways you could follow them and see what's going on. One is to call them at 419-353-1897. That's 419-353-1897. And you can call them, and that's a place where you can reserve places like the WW Night. They have an open meeting hall there that's a very nice place to have meetings or gatherings now that we can have meetings and gatherings again. You can also go to their website, wcparks.org, and they have a fun app, which you go to any app store and download WC Parks. And I noticed the past week or so, more people have been using that app because they upload photos that they take of things that are going on in the parks. And just shout out to Gainell, who put some nice pictures up there this past week. So that's the Wood County Park District. Now, we are also brought to you by our patrons. And the patrons are wonderful individuals that we just have to, shout their praises to the heavens and thank them for because they've gone to patreon.com, that's Patreon, searched for a green future, and up popped our page with its different membership levels. They picked the membership level they could afford. And so now every month a little bit comes out of our patrons' accounts and comes over to us. And this is what lets us keep the show on the air. So you guys are a big help, and many thanks to our patrons. And I would like to ask other people to join them. I'd like to ask some people who've been listening to the show for a while, just sign up. Just sign up for a couple bucks a month. It, each patron makes a huge difference to our show, and we're going to need all the help we can get to stay on the air. So those are our patrons, and we're very grateful to have them. And now, hopefully, we'll be hearing soon from my co-host, Rebecca Wood. She's supposed to be calling in any minute now. But until she calls in, let's go over to Eco News. Oh, and I just want to remind everybody that you can call in, too, at 877-909-1007 or text us at 419-973-5841. Okay, ecological news. So we'll talk about the first story I had lined up to talk about, and that is that the Waterville Bridge, which was part of the Interurban Rail system, the rail system that went from Toledo down all the way down to Cincinnati. So carbon-free transportation, because they were run on electric motors. And yes, some people might point out that the electricity for the electric motors came mostly from coal, so it wasn't quote unquote really carbon-free, but carbon-free in the fact that there were no tailpipes. These trolley cars weren't belching out carbon as they headed south. And now we can certainly have true carbon-free because we can have the wind and the solar powering them. And so anyway, this railroad, I've talked about it many times on the show before, but the bridge at Waterville is the most visible sign of that railroad that we still have. I mean, I like to find little electrical poles and things still in the woods along the trail. But this bridge at Waterville is it's on the National Register of Historic Places, and it's literally one of the most beautiful scenic bridges, I think, in the world, because it stopped being used back in the 1930s. That's the last time a train actually went over them. And what's happened in the following 100 years or so, since it was built in 1908, so it's actually been up for more than 100 years. But since it's been unused for so long, trees have grown out of it, parts of it have fallen in, but it's going across a beautiful river, and landscape painters literally come from all over the world and all over the country to set up over there at Farnsworth Park and paint pictures of this bridge because it's just so beautiful. Now, part of what happened when they built that bridge is they destroyed a island in the middle of the river called Roche de Boeuf. And that island used to be a meeting place for the local indigenous people, for the local Native American tribes. They used to hold councils on that island because it was sort of in between everything. So it's a bridge with a whole bunch of history. It's really beautiful. Unfortunately, what we just learned this past week is that the Department of Transportation, Ohio Department of Transportation, which just 5 years ago found out that they're the ones who own the bridge. Before that, nobody actually knew who owned it. They decided it has to be either repaired or they're going to take it down, and they don't have the money to repair it. So what they're going to do on June 30th, they're going to auction it off. And so if you want that bridge, the bidding is going to start at $100. Unfortunately, it needs somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 billion in repairs just to stay up. But in the Ohio Department of Transportation looked at that option and then said, well, it's only $2 million to tear it down. And so if they don't get a buyer, they plan on tearing the Waterville Bridge down, which I think would be a terrible thing because it's actually a tourist attraction. Literally, it's one of Northwest Ohio's tourist attractions, and it's got so much history. And it's just a reminder, this Interurban Railroad that it was part of is just a reminder that we can do this, folks. They did it 100 years ago. They had potentially carbon-free travel between the cities. If they could do it 100 years ago, we could certainly do it today. So for the rest of the show, give a text in and let us know if you have memories of this bridge, because the bridge itself may soon be a memory. And speaking of texts, I just got a text from my co-host, and she has lost the number to call in. So here we go, Rebecca. I will tell you the number again and tell everyone else the number is 877-909-1007. That's 877-909-1007. Okay, and so hopefully Rebecca will be calling in momentarily to assuage our curiosity about copepods. All right, well, now we're going to go off to some more distant ecological news. An update on the Fairy Creek, which we've been covering for several weeks now. We've been covering Fairy Creek, which is the old growth part of the old growth forest on Victoria Island in British Columbia. And weeks ago we interviewed somebody who was involved in the blockades there because citizens have risen up. They're trying to stop the timber companies from taking the last old growth. There's only 2.7% of the original old growth that was on that island that are left, and they're trying to save the rest of it. The protests and the blockades have shown no sign of letting up or slowing down. The number of people arrested has topped 200 this week, and literally thousands of people are now turning up at the protest sites during the day. And there's signs that these protests are spreading all over Canada. Actually, they had a protest at the capital of British Columbia and at Victoria in front of the legislature. In fact, there's a sequoia in the grounds there, and somebody climbed that sequoia and planted themselves in there. But there's been protests all over Canada, and it's starting to look kind of like what happened last year that we reported on when they were trying to force something through in terms of having a pipeline go through that the natives were trying the indigenous people were trying to fight then. And so we're going to stay on top of this, and it looks pretty much like we're going to have to watch this closely. The Premier of British Columbia has done some trickiness. The Premier has said, okay, we're going to defer cutting on the two parts where the blockades are. We're going to wait 2 years before we cut those down. But in the meantime, we're going to continue cutting the rest. And so that's why the protests haven't stopped, because what 86% of the people who live in British Columbia want, according to a Sierra Club poll, is for all the remaining old growth, which, as we've said, is just less than 3% of what was there originally. They want all the remaining old growth protected and not cut down and turned into shingles and things. So that's the update on Fairy Creek. And so now we're going to go, and I believe Rebecca has managed to join us. Rebecca, are you there?
I am here.
Hey, Rebecca, how are you doing?
All right. How about yourself?
Good. Yeah, we're still in the transition time, I guess. Since this is still the first month that we are over here on 100.7 instead of being on our old channel. So I think we can be forgiven for a little bit of confusion there.
There we go. Yeah, the radio. I can't do the show in the room with the air conditioner, which is where the computer that I can hear the show is on. So I had to come out here, and then I had to come back because you were saying the number on the radio, which I couldn't hear from here.
Right.
So anyway,
okay.
Interesting time.
All right. Well, maybe Rebecca, next week we could actually have you in the studio. I mean, Mick Gonzalez.
That would be cool.
Yeah, Mick Gonzalez had his co-host in there this morning when we came in from, and he was going out from with the cheap seats. So, maybe we'll try that next week. So,
there we go.
All right. So, just one quick note. I just got a text from someone who says, I hope you post a picture of this beautiful bridge on your YouTube channel. And yes, I plan to. In fact, I plan to drive from here to there and take a picture today of it, because it's kind of on my way home, actually. But I want to be sure to have a picture I've taken of it before it might get torn down. So, yes, there will be a picture on our YouTube channel, and I might even make that my thumbnail picture for the podcast too for this week. We'll see. All right. So, Rebecca, Dr. Bullerjahn mentioned copepods, and that set me to thinking, we don't pay enough attention to copepods. Could you perhaps enlighten us a little bit about them?
Well, I can now. Of course, initially I assumed that they were some sort of invented They were copepods, and they were something millennials were trying to use to calm down about the fact that the economy and the environment or whatnot are completely trashed. As they try to but no.
Coping pods. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay.
The poor things, who can blame them, really? But
right.
Yeah, it turns out they are crustaceans. They are tiny little transparent crustaceans that live in basically all water, fresh water, salt water, just kind of moisture, like mud and kind of the undersides of leaves that stay slightly moist all the time. Ones in ponds can actually sort of, some of them can dry up and go dormant for a while and come back. Some of them are benthic, meaning they live on the ocean floor. Some have a parasitic phase and are referred to as fish life. And, the ones that just live in places that are damp are called limnoterrestrial. There are 13,000 species of them, 2,800 of which live in fresh water. They're typically about 1 to 2 millimeters long, although they can get as big as a centimeter, I guess, in the Arctic, I believe, or the Antarctic, I forget which. They have an exoskeleton, and their whole body is transparent. And they have 2 sets of antennae, one of which they basically use as oars to locomote in the water. And frankly, they look a bit to me like the Mothman, only very tiny and transparent. See, you got to wonder, there's like tiny Mothman supernatural aliens in all the water counts for great deal. Okay, that was a bunch of crap. Do not listen to it, anyone.
Right.
You got to be careful. You don't know what people are going to listen to.
Right. But we could make a new theory that the Mothman is just a gigantic copepod that's like grown out of all proportion, maybe.
Yeah, good point. But yeah, apparently they're too small to need a circulatory system, so they have no heart, lungs, or veins or anything. And they just absorb oxygen directly into their bodies because they're tasty. They have a very fast escape response, ironically, their best predator is the seahorse because it stalks so slowly it doesn't create any turbulence and trigger the escape response, which seems like a metaphor for something. But they eat phytoplankton. They have to eat 1 million times their body weight in phytoplankton every day.
Okay, I have to do a slight correction here. Copepods clear 1 million times their body's volume in water every day, and in that all that water that they're passing through their bodies, they will eat probably up to 375,000 phytoplankton. So, but it's not 1 million times their body weight in phytoplankton. So, just to clarify.
And most of them are, I'm impressed by that, and I've always felt I had some potential in the competitive eating field. Most of them are holoplanktonic, which means they stay planktonic for their whole life cycle. So they have like a larval form, but they always stay tiny, but not exactly microscopic, and they through their whole life. That's basically what they are. They're important because they're eaten by a lot of fish and larger crustaceans, and they're the animal taken as a family. There's a lot of species, but they're the largest animal biomass on Earth. And in particular, they're environmentally important because there's one species, the Copepodia glacialis, I believe, that is constitutes 80% of all zooplankton biomass. So really, a lot of what fish eat, and we eat fish, is this little glacialis thingy poo. And the thing is, because the ice pack is shrinking because of climate change, they're being forced to compete with another species of Copepodia that's moving in on their territory, which normally lives out in the deep ocean. And normally the ice keeps it at bay. And this is a problem because this other species is less nourishing to the species and things that want to eat it. Also important because the ocean is currently the largest carbon sink that we have going on. When we got a lot of carbon that we need to sink right now. And copepods help with this because they feed near the surface, and then they sink by basically changing the oils into their bodies into denser fat, which is crazy. And so they bring carbon down with them that way. Also, they when they molt their shells, when they use the facilities, shall we say, and when they breathe, they bring carbon down into the deeper sea also. Interestingly, they suffer from parasites themselves, even though some of them are parasites. They have a particular kind that sucks up all the nutrition in their guts for a part of its life cycle and causes them to starve. They're used in saltwater aquariums as a food source, and they're also increasingly being kept by hobbyists who just think they're cool and pretty looking, which they sort of are. They can spread cholera in unfiltered water systems in a warm climate, which might eventually be a problem if New York and Boston, say, for example, which have unfiltered water, get a lot warmer. They're used to control mosquitoes in Vietnam, so they're useful for that. They don't spread cholera if you put them like rainwater, because rainwater doesn't have any cholera to begin with. And also, this is interesting, they're not kosher. So some religious Jews in New York City, they're shellfish. They're crustaceans. And they're not small enough to just ignore because you can kind of sort of see them sometimes. So, yeah, some denominations of religious Jews in New York City have started requiring all their members to put like a little cloth filter over their water, which is apparently or over their tap, which is apparently about all it takes.
But it does say that if you drink clean water from a clean source, like New York City's reservoir up in the Adirondack Mountains is literally about as clean as you can get, which is why they don't have to filter. But drinking clean water means you're drinking copepods.
Unfiltered water, yeah.
Right. Huh. Okay.
Yeah, and if you don't believe in eating shellfish, then you shouldn't drink copepods, apparently, according to some people.
Okay. Well, very interesting, Rebecca. Is there a little more, or is that have you covered it?
That's all I got. It was basically all from Wikipedia. Sometimes I have to do multiple articles, but there was a lot. There's a lot in one article. So.
Yeah. Well, it's good because they are the link between algae and animals. I mean, we've got all that. Not everything can eat algae out of the ocean, and so without the copepods in between there, as you say, as Dr. Bullerjahn said, we wouldn't have the fish. We wouldn't have the things that eat the fish like people. So.
I want to call him Dr. John, but that implies that he's a voodoo practitioner, which maybe in his own special way he is.
I don't know. You'll have to ask him. He likes to go by George. So.
Oh, okay.
That's what he prefers. So.
Yeah.
All right.
My mind thinks things that are weird.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Rebecca. And we're going right along. And there's, as I've said, now that Rebecca's online, if anybody wants to send us a nice little text, they could just send it to 419-973-5841. And we'd be happy to read it on the air. So back to ecological news. Another big environmental controversy, which is happening right now, is the Line 3 controversy up in Minnesota. And that has really heated up because what's happened is Winona LaDuke, who had she was a vice presidential candidate for the Green Party with Ralph Nader some years back, but she has called on everyone to come up to Minnesota to join in the protests and blockades against the Line 3, which is a pipeline which would carry tar sands from Canada and on its way down south to U.S. refineries. And there's a little bit of confusion because, if you look at Wikipedia or whatever, it insists Line 3 already exists, and which is true. There is a Line 3 right now. But what's happened is the old Line 3, which is old and corroding and failing, by the way, it's starting to leak, just as everyone who fought the original Line 3 predicted. But what they want to do is build a new section of Line 3, which the old Line 3 kind of did a hypotenuse on the right triangle. They did the long line, but now they want to do two legs of it. They want to come south and then go east, which, makes it longer. And the new route is what is going to go through pristine wilderness, like lakes that have wild rice growing in them and wetlands that are literally irreplaceable. And then once they've done that, they want to just abandon Line 3. Just leave it there and let it finish leaking out and rusting and putting all its toxins into the environment. So this is a terrible thing. And so the people on the reservations that the new Line 3 is going to go through, because this is one of the reasons Winona LaDuke is fighting this, is because it's going to go right through two of the reservations out in that area. They have been fighting it, tooth and nail. They've used every exhaustive, every bit of public input. They've gone to every public meeting. They've done all the appeals. They're still in court over it. And the court cases against it aren't done, but the company Enbridge out of Canada wants to go ahead and build it now before the court decisions. So, it's possible there could be a court decision against it after it's done, which that happens to environmentalists more often than you would think. So anyway, thousands of people now are heading up to Minnesota. Hundreds are being arrested, and it's just another front. It's another line in the battle is to save the planet from global warming, because the fundamental thing going on here is billions of dollars being spent on new fossil fuel infrastructure when fossil fuels are literally killing the planet. And in thousands of ways. This is not just a very simple kind of destruction of the planet. You just heard from Rebecca, complicated things are happening, like ice packs melting and copepod populations shifting, which turn out to mean in the end less fish for us. So if you like fish, you have to stop Line 3. These are the kinds of things that you come to understand if you study ecology long enough. And you really start to fundamentally grasp that idea that literally we are all connected. And so those people fighting the pipeline in Minnesota are literally fighting to protect copepods up in the Arctic, which are fighting to give us fish, give us protein, food, and stuff. So So there's an update on the Line 3 controversy. Siberia. This is a story that we covered quite a bit last year. The Siberian tundra was on fire last year in 2020, and it's one of the reasons that even though the human input of carbon dioxide went down about 6% in 2020, the overall increase in carbon was unaffected because there were forest fires and there were these tundra fires. Well, in a way, this is a continuation of last year's tundra fire story, because what happened is, in a lot of places in Siberia, the tundra fire smoldered under the ice and snow all winter and just went along there. And now that the ice and snow have melted, and now that it's spring, and they're once again experiencing extremely high heat and some record temperatures, some of those same fires, which had been quote-unquote out, have just started up again. And they're called zombie fires because they never really died, and now they're just sort of half died, and now they're back again. So Siberia is heating up again, and the smoke from these fires have drifted thousands of miles. In fact, the third largest city in Russia ended up having such dark sky from these tundra fires that they had to issue public warnings and alerts, and people had to stay inside and not go outside to breathe. And so things are not, things are in a crisis. I mean, we try to stay upbeat here at for a green future, because we do believe there will be a green future. But just the fact that we're kind of upbeat about it, and we like to joke about it and look at it from a more humorous, a lighter-hearted point of view than the whole doom and gloom crowd, that doesn't lessen the severity. I mean, if you're on a boat which is heading over a waterfall, and you've got some people out there on the deck that just go, "Oh no, we're doomed," and they laid out and start crying. That's not those aren't the people you want on the boat with you. But if there's people who are joking like, "Oh yeah," making fun of it, making light of it, but working their butts off to stop the boat and turn it around, that's more effective in my experience. The people that can look at the seriousness, understand the seriousness, look it in the eyes, and still joke about it, but fight it, but try to fix the situation. Those are the kinds of people that you need to make a green future. So those are the kinds of people I like to think are our listeners. So that's all the ecological news I had lined up for today. Rebecca, so did you hear anything earlier in the show when you were listening that kind of caught your ear or caught your interest?
Well, I had gaps because the station cut out for a minute, and then there was all the last 5 minutes of Dr. Bullerjohn's interview. There was a lot of hobbling back and forth between all rooms, but it sounded very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. And what I found fascinating was the idea that the blue-green algae, the Cyanobacteria, which are a more primitive form of algae than the green algae, the nice healthy green algae that we want lots of in the lake, that it can literally digest Roundup, and Roundup with its poison of glyphosate can kill almost any green plant. I mean, it's sort of a universal toxin for green plants. It'll kill whatever you spray it on. And the idea that these little algae can actually eat it and digest it, it kind of improved their reputation for me, because what they're doing by eating it while it's in Lake Erie is they prevent it from going on down into the Atlantic Ocean. And,
But then they produce poison, right?
Well, yeah, they do.
Well, that's a problem.
That is a problem, yes. It's a big problem. But so we don't want green algae blooms, but we do want Roundup, we want glyphosate. And of course, the whole point of organic farming is that you can produce as much food as you need without it. And it's very part of the green future is no glyphosate in the environment at all. And so
and then organic food would not be so ever-loving expensive.
Yeah, definitely. Well, sometimes it's cheaper. Now we're kind of in the borderline. Most of the time it's more expensive, but sometimes you'll find the organic is actually a little cheaper. So, all right. Well, we've come to the end of the show. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you, Rebecca, for co-hosting. This is Joe DeMare,
And Rebecca Wood.
and we are signing off.
The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time